So welcome to another fantastic Faena Rose event, conversation, presentation. Who do we have with us? Well, you're practically family now. You're back for the fourth time.
Oh, it's the fourth?
Fourth time.
Wow, all right.
And not the last time either. The one and only New York Times best-selling author, one of the foremost thinkers of our time. There's only one, Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pablo.
You know, now every time you come, you kind of like to give us a sneak peek of what you're working on next, what the latest thinking's going on in your head. Give us a little sneak peek about what we're going to talk about.
This is a little sneak peek on a podcast I've been working on for my revisionist history podcast coming out this spring, and it's all about the problem of fat tails, which is
fat tails.
I'm not going to try and explain it here. I'll let that be the mystery.
I love it. So, as we like to say, get ready, strap in for another fantastic Faena Rose event. Malcolm, thank you.
Thank you, Pablo.
But let's get started about tonight. So, Malcolm is, I don't want to call him a guest, because at this point, when it's your fourth time being with us, you're no longer a guest, you're family. And so Malcolm and Kate, his wife, and their family are our family. And, last time when he was here a year ago, he shared with us sort of this incredible story. He gave this incredible story about the Holocaust. And he shared with us sort of his insights and his theory about something that was new. And tonight, we're not going to talk about Revenge of the Tipping Point, full disclosure. We're going to talk about something new. He's going to talk about and present a new theory that is called the fat tail problem. And so he's going to explain that. And you know what, Malcolm, I was going to read your bio, but I feel like I don't think anyone needs to hear your bio, because I think you have a bunch of really passionate fans here tonight. So without further ado, put your hands together and welcome the one and only, one of our foremost thinkers of our time, New York Times best-selling artist, Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you, Pablo, for those kind words. Thank you all for coming tonight. I thought this was my third time at Faena, and I realize it's my fourth. I'm sort of become a resident of Faena. Pablo, what the deal is, Pablo puts my family up in the hotel for a week, and I agreed to give this talk. It's the broader economy. It's the broader economy in action. Next year, if I come and talk for 2 hours, you'll know that I convinced Pablo to give me a 2-week stay. Not sure what the IRS will make of that arrangement, assuming, of course, we still have an IRS. I'm also grateful for Pablo inviting me because in my latest book, The Revenge of the Tipping Point, which I gather some of you were given at the door, I have a whole chapter making fun of Miami, and I realized after I wrote it that this was not in my own best interest. I was possibly reducing my marketplace power in the negotiations with Faena, and that maybe I'd get cut back to 2 days. But this didn't happen, so thank you, Pablo, for looking the other way about my last book. So the tradition here is that I give you a preview of something that I'm working on. And so what I thought I would do this evening is give you a preview of a episode of a podcast that of my podcast, Revisionist History, that will come out this spring. And it's all about what is referred to as the theory of fat tails, which I will explain in a moment. And the story that I want to use to illustrate what I mean by that is the story of the death of George Floyd. George Floyd died almost exactly 5 years ago. It was in May of 2020, at the beginning of COVID. And I'm sure you all remember the details. It's Memorial Day, early evening, and a 911 dispatcher in Minneapolis gets a call from a cashier at a grocery store in the corner of 38th and Chicago in Minneapolis called Cup Foods. And the cashier says, a guy came in here and he passed a counterfeit $20 bill, and he's now sitting in his car across the street. And normally the cashier was going to blow off the whole thing, because why would he go to this trouble? But Cup Food has a policy that said if you accept a counterfeit bill, it comes out of your paycheck. And the guy's like, I'm not giving up $20 for this. So he calls 911, and the 911 dispatcher sends a squad car to the corner of 38th and Chicago. And two cops get out, and they approach this car, which is a Mercedes SUV. And they see two guys in the front seat, and they talk to the guy who's in the driver's seat, and turns out he's the guy who fits the description. They take him out of the car, and they handcuff him. They get his information, and they march him across the street to the squad car, and they put him in the back of the squad car. The problem, though, is that this guy doesn't want to get in the back of the squad car. He says he's claustrophobic, and he's a really big guy. He's 6'6", 6'7", 230, 240, and he starts to struggle with the police officers, and they really get in a kind of to and froing, and in all of that tumult, the guy cuts his mouth. And so what happens is one of the cops calls 911 and says, you guys got to come, bring an ambulance. We've got a guy with an injury. At that point, a second squad car pulls up, and two more officers get out. And the senior officer in that second car is a 19-year veteran of the Minneapolis Police Department by the name of Derek Chauvin. And Derek Chauvin takes charge. He says, he's the senior officer there, and he says, take the guy who's been struggling, put him on the ground, we'll cuff him, put him down, face down, and Chauvin kneels down next to this prone man and puts one of his knees on the guy's back and one of his knees on the guy's neck to restrain him. Right? Now, up until this point, everything that has happened is totally routine. This is the kind of thing that goes on in every major city countless times every night. There's somebody who needs to be arrested. Sometimes they put up a little bit of resistance, and so the police have to take matters in their own hands and bring this subject under control, right? And the idea of using what's called a neck restraint, one knee on the back and one knee on the neck, is something that has been approved by the Minneapolis Police Department for the use in cases where the subject is proving difficult to subdue. Turns out there is a fixed police camera on the corner of 38th in Chicago. So the 911 dispatcher, whose name is Jenna Scurry, is watching the whole thing in real time. Right? So she's working, she sends a squad car, and she looks up and she sees all of this takes place, and she goes, oh, okay, another routine arrest. And she goes back to doing her job and taking other calls. And after 5 or 6 minutes, she happens to look up again at the video feed on the TV screen on the wall, and she sees the same thing. She sees the same thing that she saw 5 minutes ago, which is Derek Chauvin kneeling on this guy's neck. And her first thought is, oh, the screen must be frozen, right? Because she's expecting the situation should have resolved itself, right? Once you've got a guy and you subdue the guy, then you clean it up and you get on with your business. And she sees the same thing she saw 5 minutes ago, and she turns to her supervisor and she goes, is there something wrong with the feed? Is the screen frozen? And he goes, no, the screen's not frozen. She's like, what? It's not frozen? And she's so alarmed by what she sees that she does something that in her 7-year history as a 911 dispatcher in Minneapolis, she's never done before. She calls the sergeant at the precinct that she dispatched the cars from, and she says, you got to get down to the corner of 38th in Chicago because something is wrong there. I don't know what it is, but something's not right. And of course, she's absolutely right? Something has gone very wrong. The Chauvin is still sitting with his knee on this guy's neck, and the guy he's sitting on, whose name is, of course, George Floyd, is starting to struggle. And he says, I can't breathe, over and over again. And he's trying to use his hands are handcuffed behind him, and he's trying to use his elbow to push himself off the ground so he can get some air into his lungs. And his voice starts to get weaker and weaker and weaker, and he loses control of his bowels, and he has what's called an anorexic seizure, which is when your brain gets really low on oxygen and your leg starts to jerk like this. And his eyes go into the back of his head, and his nose starts to bleed. And one of the cops says, we should check his pulse, and they check his pulse, and they can't find one. And Chauvin doesn't move. Even after they can't find a pulse, Chauvin stays on this guy's neck for 2 more minutes until the ambulance finally shows up. Right? Well, you all remember what happened next, right? After news of this incident, this tragedy, broke out, there were first riots all the way across Minneapolis, and then riots across the country, and riots around the world, right? Probably one of the most extraordinary outpourings of outrage that we've seen in the wake of a police incident in this country in a very, very long time, right? Led to a crisis in policing. So many thousands of American police officers left the profession in the wake of the anger at policing over the death of George Floyd that most big city police departments to this day are still 20, 30, even in some cases 40% understaffed, right? So we are in the middle still of one of the worst crises in the history of American policing. So the question is, how do we make sense of what happened? What's the right way to think about what went wrong on that night of Memorial Day 2020? So, like I said, I'm sure you're all familiar with the little history that I gave you. But what I wanted to do first is to retell it through the eyes of the very first officer to arrive on the scene that night, who was a young man named Thomas Lane. He's the guy who first approaches Floyd's car. He's the guy who takes Floyd out of the car. He's the guy who really sets all of this in motion. If you remember back, I don't know how many of you would watch some of the body cam or bystander videos from the George Floyd case. He's the tall guy. There's a young guy who's 6'7". That's Thomas Lane. And right after the event, after Floyd's death, Lane is interviewed by the FBI. And this is before this case has spiraled out of control, before Lane realizes that he is himself facing criminal charges. It's just an informational interview, but we have the transcript. So it's really interesting to see what Lane was saying basically 2 days later. So first of all, he describes just what I just walked you through, the scene we all know. They get there, they see Floyd, they take him out of the car. He doesn't want to get in the back of the squad car. They struggle. He calls 911, right? And what Lane says is the reason he calls for an ambulance is not just because Floyd has cut his mouth, but because he thinks that Floyd's on drugs. And he thinks this because when they searched him, they found a glass pipe. And also they see around the edges of Floyd's mouth all kinds of dried saliva, which is a tell sometimes that somebody has been taking fentanyl or something similar. He's also acting really, really strangely in the kind of erratic way that you would associate with someone who's seriously high, right? So let me just read to you from Lane's deposition. Question, this is the FBI agent asking him. So there was more to calling the paramedics than just checking his mouth, right? And Lane says, well, I think I had mentioned this could be possibly excited delirium or something. Now, excited delirium is something that cops worry about a lot. And it's a term we use to describe a kind of heightened agitation and aggression and distress, often associated with someone who is on drugs. And one of the things that we know about people who are in this state is, first of all, that they behave in a way that is profoundly erratic. Secondly, in a way that can often harm themselves. And thirdly, that their health status is highly volatile, that something could happen untoward without any kind of notice. So Lane sees this, and Lane's first thought is, this guy, we need to be careful with this guy. This guy is not doing well, right? So this is Lane. That was the other reason for stepping it up, because he might be in medical distress. Now, what Lane is referring to by stepping it up is he actually calls 911 a second time, right? He first calls for the ambulance because he sees us cut his mouth. And then as he realizes that Floyd is on something, he calls back and he upgrades the call to what's called code 3, which is the highest level of urgency. Basically, lights and sirens. Come now. I'm really, really worried about this guy, right? Question. Were you getting a sense that Mr. Floyd was having a medical emergency? Lane. I felt something was going on. Question. You thought he was passing out? Lane. Yeah. Right? Now, if you look at any of the body cam or bystander videos from that night, you can see exactly this moment that Lane is talking about, right? Chauvin is on the scene. He says, let's get Floyd on the ground. He puts his knee on Floyd's neck, and then Lane turns to Chauvin and says, basically, this guy's not doing well, right? Question. And you articulated that, Lane, yeah. And how was that suggestion received by your partners? They said, this is fine. Who said that? Lane. Chauvin said, we're going to hold him here until EMS arrives. And I just suggested, with excited delirium, maybe we should roll him on his side I think it's something I had previously learned on a previous job. Will you roll someone on their side to the recovery position? Now, what he's referring to here is something that all police officers are trained to do, right? When you have someone who is prone on the ground, face down, with their hands behind them, handcuffed, and you're putting pressure on their chest and their neck, they are in a position of great vulnerability, right? That's why they can no longer struggle, or it's very hard for them to get away, but it also puts them at peril of being asphyxiated. Right? So every police officer is instructed that if you do this particular move and put your knee on someone's neck, you can only do it briefly. You do it, and the minute the situation is under control, you get off that guy's neck and you get off his back. And you roll them on their side into the recovery position. And that's what Lane's saying. He's saying, he's under control. Let's roll him on his side. This guy's already in medical distress. I don't want things to get out of control, right? This is the exact exchange from the body cam video. Lane says, we should roll him on his side. Chauvin says, no, we're staying put where we got him. Lane says, okay, just worry about the excited delirium or whatever. Chauvin says, that's why we got the ambulance coming. Lane says, okay, I suppose. And Chauvin says, that's fine, right? A minute later, Lane speaks up again. He says to Chauvin, I think he's passing out, meaning Floyd's in trouble, right? Let's get off him. What does Chauvin do? Nothing. Just ignores him, right? A minute later, Lane pipes up again. He said, you want him on his side? Meaning, he really shouldn't be on his stomach. We've got to roll him over, right? Lane is trying to do the right thing here, right? He understands the gravity of the situation. We've got a man here who is in trouble, right? But the crucial thing here is the way he tries to convince Chauvin to roll Floyd on his side. He doesn't make a declarative statement. We have to do this now, or this guy's going to die, right? He has to be on his side. He asks a question. He kind of softens it. He's like, should we roll him over, right? He mentions excited delirium, and he's concerned about Floyd's safety, but he undercuts that concern with words like, that sort of soften his alarm, like, I just worry about excited delirium, or whatever, right? And then finally, after Chauvin shuts him down, he says, okay, I suppose, which is a kind of passive-aggressive agreement. What sociologists call this is mitigated speech. And mitigated speech is is something that people have talked about for years in the aviation industry. I have a whole chapter on this in my book, Outliers. That for years people realized that one of the major causes of plane crashes was mitigated speech in the cockpit. The first officer would identify a problem and would try and inform the captain of the problem, but the first officer would say something, would communicate that problem in such a mitigated way that the captain wouldn't respond, wouldn't understand what he's getting at. There's a famous case of this, which is the 1982 Air Florida crash in Washington, D.C., where it's a snowy day in Washington, D.C. It's in the spring, and the Air Florida plane has been on in the line waiting for takeoff for a very long time. And they've been there so long that the ice is starting to build up on the top of the wings. And the first officer has been watching this, and he's starting to get concerned. He thinks they should get out of the long line and go back and get a second round of de-icing. And so he has to convince, he's the first officer, he's not in charge of the plane, he's got to convince the captain to do this, right? Which will set them back and make them late and all those kinds of things. So this is what he says. First officer, look how the ice is just hanging on his back there. See that? The captain says nothing. So the first officer tries again. See all those icicles on the back there and everything? Captain ignores him. First officer tries a third time. Boy, this is a losing battle here on trying to de-ice those things. It gives you a false sense of security, doesn't it? Nothing. Plane's getting closer and closer and closer to the top of the line, right? First officer tries one last time. Let's check those tops again since we've been sitting here a while, right? Nothing. He starts with a hint. Look at that ice. Then a question. See those icicles? Then a suggestion. Let's check those wing tops. And each time he's removing one layer of mitigation and getting closer and closer to what is really on his mind, which is that he's completely terrified, right? The plane has got ice covering on the wings, and they're about to take off in the middle of a snowstorm in March in Washington, D.C. Only at the very end does he finally get to saying what's on his mind, right? And it's just after takeoff as the plane is plunging into the Potomac. And he turns to the captain, he goes, Larry, we're going down, Larry. And the captain finally speaks for the first time. He says, I know it. Right? You can go online, you can find that bit of tape from the black box, and it will break your heart. Right? Thomas Lane is in exactly the same position as the first officer on that plane. Both of those guys understand the gravity of the situation that they're in. The plane has ice, the man on the ground is dying, right? But they have a superior who doesn't understand what's going on, who for some reason that they can't figure out is completely closed to the seriousness of the situation that they're in, right? Who is incapable apparently of processing this new information about the gravity of their situation. And neither of these subordinates can actually come out and just say, no, we got to fix this now, right? They can't say that. Why? Because they're subordinates, right? One of the things that comes out in the Thomas Lane interview is that at the time of the arrest of George Floyd, he had been on the force for 4 days. 4 days. It's a rookie, right? And not only that, so he's got Chauvin, who comes in, who's a 19-year veteran. So Chauvin's got 18 years and 8 months on him. Not only that, his training officer during his probation, which had just ended, was Derek Chauvin, right? So here we have a situation. I mean, you've got to appreciate the dilemma that Thomas Lane is in. Not only he sees that George Floyd is in real trouble, but he's a rookie, right? Memorial Day was a Monday. He started work on the Minneapolis PD on the previous Thursday. Not only is he a total rookie, but his mentor is the guy who's shutting him down. What's he supposed to do, right? He's in an impossible problem. Secondly, and this is the point that I want to spend the most time on this evening, the story of Thomas Lane tells us that the problem that led to the death of George Floyd was not the Minneapolis Police Department, right? Even a rookie on the Minneapolis Police Department understood that something was going very wrong with George Floyd. The problem that night was Derek Chauvin. If Derek Chauvin had never shown up, if the second squad car had not been called to the scene, if the whole incident had been managed by Thomas Lane, he would have rolled George Floyd over after 15 seconds. George Floyd would have lived, right? There would have been no national eruption of pain and outrage. You wouldn't even know the name George Floyd, right? The whole problem is that Derek Chauvin shows up that night. Right? The whole thing is about Derek Chauvin. Now, here's where I want to take a step back and talk about this idea of fat tails, this idea that I said motivated me to go back and look at this case. This all starts with there's a very simple way you can use to think about social problems. One is to understand them as systemic problems. So many large cities over the last couple of years, decades or so, have gone to their most consistently underachieving schools, the schools that are considered the worst in their school system, and decided that the best way to fix that school is not just to bring in a new principal, not to give the school additional resources, not to get rid of some teachers and bring in better teachers, but just to shut down the whole school. Shut it down, take the kids, disperse them throughout the system, take the teachers, disperse them all kinds of places, right? And what we found when that happens with really underachieving schools is that the kids do a lot better when you just shut down the school and send them somewhere else. In other words, the problem of a school underachieving was a systemic problem. It wasn't a problem you could solve by replacing one or two different individuals or fixing up this or that. The problem was that the entire culture of the institution was in some way deeply dysfunctional and pathological, and the only real course available to reforming it was shutting it down and starting over somewhere else, right? That is a systemic problem. But not all problems fit that pattern. So there are a whole set of problems that look very different when you analyze them. Let me give you an example. In New York City, over the last couple of years, they put up 2,500 automated cameras at stoplights. And in last year, in 2023, those automated cameras gave out a total of 7 million speeding tickets. Okay? So we have this beautiful database of speeding in New York City. Now, what do you find out when you look at that data? Does that data tell you that New York City has a systemic problem with speeding drivers? Actually, no. If you were to make a graph out of all of those 7 million tickets, what you would discover is that they are not evenly distinguished across the million or 2 million drivers of New York. The overwhelming majority of people who get caught for speeding only get caught for speeding once or twice, right? But there are a very small number of people at the very edge of the distribution who got caught 1 million times. Like, there are 186 drivers in New York City who got more than 100 tickets in 2023, right? The term that police use for these 186 drivers are super speeders. And the super speeders are the people who end up killing pedestrians at crosswalks. They're the ones who are causing all the problems. They're the ones who terrify you when you're crossing the street with your kids. Most of us, when we get a speeding ticket, we get the hint, right? We slow down the next time. These guys don't do that. When they looked at these 186, they realized that they had, on average, each one of those 186 people had $11,000 in unpaid speeding tickets, right? Which tells you something about the ticket collection capabilities of New York City. If you were to make a graph out of all of those 7 million tickets in New York City, what the graph would look like is you'd have a very, 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 very long line hovering just above the horizontal axis, right? That would go on and stretch on for as long as the eye could see. And then when finally you got to the end, the graph would go like this, right? It would have what economists call a fat tail. Speeding in New York is a fat tail problem. I am obsessed with fat tail problems. I like to collect them. I'm a student of them. If you have one in your life, please share it with me. I have one in the book that you all got, The Revenge of the Tipping Point. There's an example of one of my favorite fat tail problems, which is COVID. COVID was totally fat tail. We thought when we were in the middle of COVID, I think I talked about this last year, we thought when we were in the middle of COVID that all of us, if we were infected, bore a roughly equal risk of infecting someone else. That is so not true. Completely, as it turns out, false. If everyone in this room right now had COVID, and what are there, 300 people in this room? Probably 280 of you bore basically a minimal to infinitesimal risk of passing on your virus to someone else. But 20 of you probably were emitting virus at a rate 50 to 100 times greater than everybody else. COVID is spread by super spreaders, a very small very small percentage of the population who, for reasons we don't understand, when they get infected with a virus, they just produce it in unbelievable amounts. When you have an outbreak of COVID in any group, it's because there happens to be a super spreader in the group, right? That is a classic fat tail problem. If I'm a super spreader, by the way, you guys are all really in trouble because I've been talking to you. I could go on, but the lesson of New York's super speeders and COVID super spreaders is that before you set out to solve a problem, you have to know what kind of problem you're solving. Are you solving a systemic problem? Is this underperforming high schools where you just shut them up, down, the whole thing and start over? Or is this a fat tail problem where the solution to solving the problem is just to target a very, very small group of people who are responsible for an overwhelming part of damage, right? So, when you have a problem with a police department, what shape, what kind of form, which of those two categories do police department problems fall into? Is it systemic or is it fat tail? Well, the city that has the best database of use of force complaints in America is Chicago. So just so you know, the best proxy for how well behaved a police department is how many use of force complaints it gets, right? So every police department in the country keeps track of these things, and they tell you something really, really important about how well behaved that police department is. So Chicago has an online searchable database where they've got 250,000 use of force complaints that were generated against 25,000 Chicago Police Department officers from the period of 1988 to 2018. It's just, if you're a data nerd, it is just a joy to go through this database. And what happens if you put all of those complaints on a graph? The graph looks exactly like the graph I was talking about with New York super speeders. Those complaints are not evenly distributed against everyone in the Chicago Police Department. There are a huge number of officers who have a very small number of complaints, but there are a small number at the very end who have a massive amount of complaints, right? The graph just hovers along like this for as long as the eye can see, just above the horizontal axis. At the very end, it goes like this. It has a fat tail, right? Turns out, at the very top, when you sort of rank all of the Chicago police officers, there's a guy at the very top, a guy named Jerry Finnegan, who has the most use of force complaints in the history of the Chicago Police Department. He is the Tiger Woods of the Chicago Police Department. He registered over the course of his career 175 complaints. Now, just so you know, you probably get a complaint for every, God knows, 50 times you use force. So if he has 175 complaints, you get a sense of just what he's like as a human being. I got so interested in Jerry Finnegan that he just got out of prison, because of course he was in prison. He was trying to kill one of his colleagues. He did this interview with Barstool Sports, a guy named Eddie from Barstool Sports, which is one of the single greatest interviews. He was there to promote his new podcast, which is called, I'm not making this up, Finnegan's Wake. So good. I'm sorry, I blew it. Finnegan's Take. It's even better. So he's giving us, and he looks like every cop in every cop movie ever. It's like, it's uncanny how much cops in real life resemble Hollywood cops. Anyway, I'm just going to read, just because you're all here, I'm just going to read you my favorite part of the interview. I mean, honestly, Eddie, I love that job. There isn't a day that goes by. I'm 61. There's not a day that goes by that I would say, fuck, I'd like to be out there, fucking chasing those bad dudes. Like I told some attorney in a deposition one time, he's done so many depositions. When he's telling stories like at a bar, he's just talking about like his depositions. I said, as far as I'm concerned, being a policeman in Chicago is better than being a fighter pilot. The fucking adrenaline was just incredible. I used to say it was like you had ringside seats to the greatest show on earth. What? Now, there's two problems with a cop like Jerry Finnegan. Problem number one is he's 175 use of force complaints. So just by himself, he generates more ill will in the community than like 50 other cops. But that's not the real reason he's a problem. The big reason that guys like Jerry Finnegan are a problem is that they corrupt other cops, right? So the word that sociologists use to describe this is network spillover. And there's a really amazing paper by a guy named Andrew Papachristos, who's a criminologist at Northwestern. And what he did is he took that database of all those use of force complaints and he divided it up by networks. So he basically took every cop in that database and grouped them with the other cops they worked with, served with, their partners. And his question was, how do use of force complaints operate in these networks? And what he discovered was if no one in your network as a police officer has ever gotten a use of force complaint, your chances of ever getting a use of force complaint are basically minimal. They're zero. It's not going to happen. But if there's even a modest number of cops in your network who get lots of use of force complaints, your chance of getting one goes up by 26%, which is massive, right? In other words, there is contagion here. If you hang out with somebody who is a bad seed, you end up picking up those same behaviors, even though you're not someone who would ordinarily be disposed that way. And that's Derek Chauvin, right? That is Derek Chauvin in a nutshell. He is the Jerry Finnegan of the Minneapolis Police Department, right? He's got a mountain of complaints. There's this video that came out, and I think many people sadly never saw it because it only came out in the last couple of months. And it's the second, it's a video from 2017, and 3 years before George Floyd. And it's body cam footage from a 911 call. A woman calls and says her son has assaulted her. And so the cops show up, and we have the entire thing. We see them get out of their squad car, they go into the woman's apartment, they talk to her at length, and then she says, my son's down the hall. And you see them walk down the hall, and they open the door, and there's a kid on the floor of his bedroom on his phone. He's 14 years old, he's a kid, right? And the officers enter the room, and then we see the lead officer say to the kid, stand up, you're under arrest. And the kid, 14, says, why am I under arrest, right? My mom's drunk. She was like behaving erratically. She just calls 911 anytime she's wasted. What are you doing? You can't arrest me here. Like, and the cop says, get up. And he says, struggles up and gets, it's like he's really slow. He's like, he's a teenager. He's not gonna, he's like freaked out by this. And the cop says, get up now, right? Kid gets really startled. And the cop goes over, takes his flashlight, starts whacking him on the head with his flashlight. So much that the kid gets a cut on his head that's gonna require stitches. Then the cop grabs him and puts him in a chokehold. And the kid passes out. Cop puts him on the ground, handcuffs him, and kneels down next to him, puts one knee on his back and one knee on his neck, and sits there for the next 16 minutes. You know what the name of that cop is? Derek Chauvin, right? Now, I have watched the George Floyd video many times, and each time it's distressing. But I have to say, when I watch the video of that kid, it's more distressing. And I realize that's not rational because the kid survived and George Floyd did not, but there is something about seeing everything unfold in real time against a kid that if you watch it, you can go on video. It's called video Derek Chauvin, John Pope. And I defy anyone to watch that video and not break down in tears. It will break your heart. And there's this moment in the thing that is the moment that I cannot look at without breaking down, which is where Chauvin first starts beating the kid around the head with his flashlight. And he's a kid, and he does what a kid does when something really weird and unexpected happened. He just sits there and he kind of blinks and he goes, "Ow, you're hurting me," right? It'll kill you. And then the mom comes in and she starts screaming, "Don't kill my son. Don't kill my son," right? But that's not the worst part of the video. The worst part of the video is that when Chauvin gets down and he's kneeling on that kid's neck and the kid is weeping and saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And there's 7 other cops in the room at that point. You know what they do? One of the cops turns his body cam to the wall so that he's no longer collecting footage on them. And then all of them file out of the room without saying a word. They 100% know that what Derek Chauvin is doing is a crime, is a violation of every code and principle and ethic of the police department. But they don't say a word, right? They have become complicit, right? They've been corrupted by their association with Derek Chauvin. And that's exactly what happens to Thomas Lane 3 years later. A really good cop who saw that something was amiss with George Floyd and who tries 4 times to get his mentor and superior officer to change his approach, eventually gives up, right? And you know who's sitting on, at the very end, as George Floyd is dead on the ground, you know who's sitting on his legs? Thomas Lane. After Floyd is killed, Minneapolis goes crazy. I'm sure you remember this. There's riots and protests and looting and buildings are burned, hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. And one night, the crowd gathers outside the house of the mayor, a guy named Jacob Fry, who was 39 at the time. By the way, an extraordinary, really interesting, intelligent guy. If you are a Democrat and you are looking for a ray of hope in the world, Jacob Fry may well be your man. He'd just been elected a couple years earlier, and he's like Minneapolis Democrat. He's like a good, solid progressive. And he walks out in the crowd. There's 2,000 people outside his house. And they start chanting at him, "Defund the police, defund, are you gonna defund the police?" Now that phrase now became, we all know that became part of the George Floyd protest. At the time, it's a brand new phrase. Fry's never heard it before. This is just days after the death of George Floyd. And he stands up and he says, "I'm not gonna defund the police. Are you crazy? It's a terrible idea." And they start booing him and they start throwing things on him. And if you there's a television footage of that night which you can watch, and you just see this crowd of 2,000 incredibly angry people, and like Jacob Fry, like walking. He's a little guy. He's like my size, just like walking through this crowd, and people just pouring shame on him, right? And they start chanting, "Jacob, go home. Jacob, go home." Now, why was it so clear to Jacob Fry that defunding the police was a really bad idea? Because he knew all about the logic of the fat tail, right? If the problem is that you have a small number of bad apples in a police department, then what's the point in upending the whole institution? What you should be doing is just cutting off the fat tail, right? You should be identifying people like Derek Chauvin and getting rid of them, right? And that's what was on his mind. And a couple days later, he stands up at a press conference and he says, this is a good, strong, progressive Democrat, says, Unless we are willing to tackle the elephant in the room, which is the police union, there won't be a culture shift in this department. And this is the part of the George Floyd story that doesn't get a lot of attention, which is that there was this widespread thought after George Floyd that the problem in the Minneapolis Police Department was systemic, but it was never systemic. The problem was that it had a fat tail, and they were prohibited by their union from getting rid of the fat tail, right? Remember, I don't know how many of you guys in this room remember Daniel Oates, who for years was the police chief here in Miami Beach. Really, really well-respected guy, one of the kind of most intelligent, reform-minded police chiefs in the country. And he told me about how, I think he leaves Miami Beach and goes to be the police chief in Aurora, or the other way around, but he was telling me about his time at Aurora, and he said he was there for 8 years, and there were 16 police officers that he desperately wanted to fire. That was his fat tail. Out of a police force of 650 officers, he had 16 bad apples. And these were guys who were like drunk on the job, incredibly violent, lying on their field reports. I mean, doing stuff that like absolutely beyond the pale. And he decides he wants to get rid of them, and he spends months trying to get their termination through. Finally, after huge long negotiations, he gets severance agreements with 12 of the 16, but the agreements are written in such a way that the officers depart with a clean record, so they just go and work at another police department, right? So now he's got 4 left, and he fires the 4, flat out. But then, the way that many police collective bargaining agreements work, if you get fired, you have a right to appeal, obviously, but the appeal is an arbitration hearing with an arbitrator appointed by the union, and the hearing starts over. It's not like a simple review of the facts of the original case. They start the case from the very beginning all over again. And what happens? 3 of those 4 terminations get reversed on appeal. So out of the 16 officers that he felt were unfit to practice in the profession of law enforcement, he manages to fire exactly 1. Right? Now, it turns out that that's a problem throughout this entire country. There's a law professor named Stephen Rushin who compiled a list of what percentage of termination cases in major American cities get overturned on appeal, and the officers come back and keep working. And I'm just going to give you a little sample of some of the cities. Miami-Dade, 37% of fired police officers get their job back. Oklahoma City, 40%. Phoenix, 40%. Washington, D.C., 45%. Philadelphia, 62%. Denver, 67%. And the prize winner, San Antonio, 70%. Right? If we live in a society where we can't get rid of cops like Derek Chauvin, we're going to have another George Floyd case, and another one, and another one, and another one. Thank you.
So, Malcolm, that was fantastic. I think at this point we're going to, thank you by the way, we're going to open this up to Q&A. So please put your hands up and we'll be coming around. Who's in Orlando in the center here? Do you want to grab? Just hold on 1 second. Wait till we bring the mic to you, and please state your name and your question.
Yeah, my name is Lou Addis. I'm actually a medical doctor, and I think in medicine we have the same problem, where you will have a few doctors where the authoritarian of the medical doctor is supreme, whether it's in an OR or an ER or somewhere where somebody is making the decisions, where you will have a junior person who really senses that something is really wrong, and it doesn't get to the head because they don't want to deal with it. You know?
Yeah.
And so, to me, it's an abuse of power. And in the medical field, we do deal with it. We deal with it very well. If a critical error is made in a medical profession and they cast you as an outlier, you either get remedial training or you're out and you lose your license. And I think the same thing has to happen when whether you're a police officer or whether you're a pilot. you're responsible for other people's lives. And this is really, it's disgusting to hear about it. And right, it's non-negotiable.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. There's a lot to be learned from cross professions. Who's next?
Me? Nitin, who's asking? Me asking? Okay. Nitin Rai, in your research, I'm assuming you researched through who the brutality was inflicted on. What percentage of those victims were young black males or black males?
The kid, John Pope, is a young black male. And of course, George Floyd is black, which raises this really interesting question of whether there was something about, in my podcast, I didn't go into it here, but when I do 2 podcasts on this, in the first one, I try and speculate a little bit about what is going through Derek Chauvin's brain when he does this. And it does seem like the 14-year-old kid is big for his age. And I think there's something about, and Chauvin is small. I think there's something about large black men that triggers him in some way, that where he thinks of them, he perceives them as being a threat even when they're not. There's clearly a kind of a complex psychological disturbance going on with him. I mean, it's so kind of obvious that something's wrong with him that it is astonishing he remained on the force for 19 years. I mean, it just defies all explanation.
Hi, I'm Christine Alward, a Faena Rose member. Thank you so much, Malcolm, for being here. So obviously the data and the stories are incredibly discouraging. And I think it's very hard, especially when we see what's happening right now. Like, you feel like you can't control or make a difference in many ways. So how do we help solve these problems?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, what was very heartening about, there's some heartening responses to the George Floyd case. If you look closely, for example, at the responses of the Black Lives Matter movement, they were all over this union thing. They were like, that was one of their principal points. And I think bringing for people on that side of the ideological continuum to be making a very strong case that the police unions had too much power in this incident was very, very useful in sort of changing the discussion a little bit. Jacob Fry makes a really interesting point, which he says that what happened in Minneapolis was that there was an unwillingness to increase, to give appropriate increases for the salaries of police officers. So in exchange, what the city did was to give away management rights to the police union. They traded money for control. And so they had essentially lost control of the police department because they were unwilling to fund it. And which is weird because his conclusion, in other words, was that was the opposite of defund the police. We had to refund the police to get it back, which is a very interesting idea. I always remain optimistic that as long as we learn from these kinds of crises, we can do a better job the next time. Maybe this is an instance where my optimism will be tested.
The back. Hi. Hello. Hey, my name's Jeff Gutchis. Thank you very much. I have 2 questions for you. One, have you ever seen a situation where a fat tail problem evolves into a systemic problem? And how do you stop that?
Yeah.
And number 2 is, if you have a situation where you have a local government that has corruption problems, if that's a systemic problem, can you just get rid of that government like you do a school and fix it that way?
Oh, interesting.
Or you can just hire Jeff.
Yeah. I'm reluctant to answer the second question because I believe, I suspect there is some Miami reference that I'm missing. No, so really interesting. That's a very interesting question. And I think building off that research I mentioned by Andrew Papachristos, one model that he would suggest is that a fat tail problem left unaddressed turns into a systemic problem. That what you do, unless you zero in and crack down on those offenders in the fat tail, that you get so much network spillover and so much kind of contagion, they infect so many officers that before long the whole system is rotten. And that's what's going on in that story about John Pope, when 7 other officers file out of the room and don't say anything. You're moving very rapidly from a problem with Derek Chauvin to a problem with the entire precinct, right? So it is dangerous to tolerate this kind of behavior for too long because it changes the norms. And so I think of those two things as being in some way interestingly linked.
To your right.
I can't see anything because there's a light.
So we're going to come right here,
Oh, yeah.
Malcolm. Center.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Javi, and I guess my question to you is, does a fat tail problem exist in any social context? Meaning, whether you look at crime, your example of the tickets, the police force, corruption, any other social pattern, does it always exhibit a fat tail?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I'm a big believer that fat tails are everywhere and that we likely underdiagnose fat tails. So, and there's some fat tails, like Bernie Madoff was a fat tail. And what always attracts me about Madoff is that what Madoff proves is that you can actually create a Ponzi scheme and get away with it for a very long time. So you would think that lots of people would start Ponzi schemes after Bernie Madoff, right? You just make it up and no one catches it. You make it up and you have a big house on Palm Beach and you have a plane and fly around and then with luck you last 30 years. Why, by the way, I've always been curious about Bernie Madoff. How do you not have a getaway plan? I've been puzzled about this. You're smart enough to fool some of the smartest investors in the world for 30 years. You're not smart enough to have like a fake passport and like a secret house in Uruguay. Like, what is the disconnect here? He's hanging around in the Hamptons when they arrest him. Like, dude, no, get on a plane and go. Anyway, I've always been puzzled by that. But it's that's fat tail. Like there seems to be very little contagion there. There haven't been 1,000 copycats. I mean, that I know about. So I kind of think we know in all manners of criminality, you see there's a great statistic in New York City about shoplifting in New York, about how I've forgotten the exact number, but it's like there's 150 people who are responsible for 60% of the shoplifting in Manhattan. Like it's some insane number. And they just keep arresting them and letting them back out. Like at some point it's going to recur to somebody. It's the same. Didn't we see you like 18 times over the last week and a half? And they will. So I'm of the mind these are everywhere, and we have a default assumption that problems are systemic, and they tend overwhelmingly not to be. I think at some point.
Hi,
okay.
Over here.
Yeah.
My name is Albert. Thanks for sharing these stories with us. Are you working on anything to try to solve this problem, or is there anything that some of us can do to try to solve it, besides like voting, right?
Yeah. I don't solve problems as a general rule. I much prefer identifying them and wringing my hands. I leave solutions to others. There's no upside to a writer solving a problem, right? Then you're done. Like, who's going to... I just wrote a book with a sequel. If I solved my problems in the first one, there's no sequel, right? No, I'm joking, but yeah, I mean, I'm not. Yeah, I think the first step in coming up with solutions is alerting people to the problem. That's in many ways, I think, the crucial step. I think once things are identified, there's a whole machinery. I think usually situated to try and. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I don't know how many more questions I'm allowed.
Two more questions.
Two more questions, probably. Okay.
Hey, Malcolm. Olga Ovadenko, Faena member. Thank you so much for being back. I have maybe a book proposal, but also a question for you. So you gave us a great presentation on the fat tail problem. Given we're in sunny Miami and we're all optimists here, give us your favorite example of a, I guess, fat tail solution or a positive fat tail problem. Maybe one that you haven't written about yet, but want to.
Oh. Well, you know, this is a dumb one, but the one thing that most sports fans don't understand about professional athletes is how steep the fat tail is at the end of the athletic distribution. So, like, LeBron James is not a better basketball player than you. LeBron James is like an order of magnitude better than the very best basketball player you've previously met in your life. You know, Serena Williams is not just a very good tennis player. She's unimaginably good. And if you actually watch any elite athlete close up, you realize the fat tail's like that. There's like a tiny group of people. They're just so much better than the rest of us that, like, you can't even, and we always make this mistake. We think they're kind of versions of us. They're not versions of us. There's a whole thing on Instagram of golf pros making, like, they're in their backyard and they're hitting balls over their house, like into, you know, a small child's swimming pool in their front yard, and it's just like, boom, one after another, plops. And you're like, you know, they're aliens. Like, nobody else can do that. I'm a runner, and the same thing with running. Like, you go running, I think I'm a good runner. I have all kinds of ego about it. When I go running with a real runner, I'm like, okay. I might as well just go home and lie on the couch. So that's my extreme fat tail.
I think
One last question.
One last question. Right now.
Thank you for coming. I wanted to ask you, I don't know how many children or their ages, but do you think teaching people to not be complacent is part of a solution? And to hold people that are complacent accountable?
Yeah. Wow, you've saved the hardest question for last. Do I think? No. In a perfect world, and I do think the virtue of these kinds of periodic emotional public moments that we have, and George Floyd was one of them, and it was, you know, I have all kinds of mixed feelings about what happened afterwards, and in ways, as I said at the beginning, in ways that we don't always recognize, we are still reckoning with the consequences of George Floyd. Every major police department in this country is massively understaffed. Nobody wants to be a police officer anymore. That's a serious problem. But at the same time, I do think that there was a lot of virtue in how much public displays of distress and concern and emotion came out of that. It was a reminder that these kinds of interactions between the police and the public matter. They go to the core of who we are, how we relate to the state that we're a part of, the country we're a part of, the communities we're a part of, that you can't be complacent about that kind of thing. And it also was a reminder that policing's really, really hard and really, really important. And I think sometimes we get complacent about that too. We think anyone could be a police officer. We think it's really easy to be an effective one. We think, no, it's really hard. And I think that we need to kind of keep that in the back of our minds when we think about approaching these issues in the future. Right. All right. Thank you all very much. Invite me back next year.
With that said, Malcolm, I want to thank you so much for coming. By the way, he is an incredible runner. He runs a sub 6-minute mile, doesn't he? 5-minute mile, pardon me. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Malcolm, thank you.